Carbon is one of the most important elements on Earth. All living things are made of carbon. Most of the fuels that humans use for energy are primarily made of carbon, including the food we eat. Gases made from carbon, such as carbon dioxide, played an important role in regulating climate. Biological activity causes carbon to be constantly converted among different forms and locations. These movements of carbon are referred to as carbon cycle. The global carbon cycle describes the exchanges of carbon between the atmosphere, terrestrial vegetation, soils and organic matter, ocean, and fossil fuels. These exchanges are continually changing and not in perfect balance. Human activities are converting oil, coal, natural gas, plant, and soil organic carbon into carbon dioxide, which is accumulating in our atmosphere, where it contributes into greenhouse effect. The atmosphere is a relatively small reservoir of carbon containing less than 1% of the Earth's total carbon pool. Because it's so small, even a slight increase in imports to the carbon atmosphere can have a big impact on the total concentration over time. The amount of carbon in terrestrial vegetation is comparable to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Vegetation takes the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. However, the amount that humans continue to add through fossil fuel emissions is more than plants are able to use, so it accumulates in the atmosphere. The CO2 the plants that are able to use becomes new plant tissue. Most of the plant tissue winds up naturally dying and fall into the ground to become plant litter, and eventually is decomposed or transferred to soil matter. In many parts of the world, organic matter accumulates faster than de- in many parts of the world, organic matter accumulates faster than decomposes, adding to soil carbon pools. Within the soil, there is more than twice as much carbon locked up in organic material than there is carbon in the atmosphere. Human activities such as land use changes and greenhouse gas emissions accelerate the conversion of soil carbon to carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas which causes heat to be retained between the Earth and the atmosphere. Some radiation leaving the Earth's surface is trapped by greenhouse gases, causing heat to be retained. This happens because carbon dioxide absorbs outgoing infrared radiation and re-emits it in all directions, including back down on the Earth's surface. This leads to increased temperature in a low atmosphere, which in turn can increase the rate of decomposition, which further increase the amount of atmospheric carbon. These this creates a magnifying cycle of increased warming and increased atmospheric carbon. Nitrogen is an essential constituent of all major organic compounds present in living organisms, that is, amino acids, proteins, enzymes, nucleotides, and nucleic acids. Different processes that occurred during nitrogen cycle include nitrogen fixation, nitrogen assimilation, ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification. Nitrogen is picked up as inorganic compound from the atmosphere and is changed into organic form by plants and some prokaryotes. The atmosphere contains 78% of nitrogen in gaseous state, yet animals cannot use it directly. They can use nitrogen either in organic forms as ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates, or in organic form as urea. Nitrogen fixation is the conversion of nitrogen into oxides of nitrogen. Thunderstorm, lightning, and rain help in transfer of large quantity of nitrogen into soil. Biological nitrogen fixation is carried out by symbiotic bacteria. Rhizobium present in root nodules of leguminous plant like pea. Cyanobacteria like nostoc and anabaina present also in nitrogen. Some free-living bacteria like Clostridium also fix nitrogen in soil. Nitrogen assimilation plants take up nitrogen and synthesize glucose from it. Other organisms feed on plants to get nitrogen. Ammonification involves the decomposition of proteins of dead plants and animals and nitrogenous waste like urea, uric acid, and etc. of animals to ammonia in the presence of ammonifying bacteria. Nitrification involves the oxidation of ammonia to nitrites through nitrites. Nitrification involves the Nitrification involves the oxidation of ammonia to nitrates through nitrites in the presence of nitrifying bacteria, that is Nitrococcus, Nitrosomonas, etc. The nitrification is the conversion of nitrates to nitrous oxide and then to molecular nitrogen, is carried out by the nitrifying bacteria, Thiobacillus. Thus, there is continuous cycling of nitrogen between the atmosphere and living as well as non-living systems. The phosphorus cycle differs from the other major biogeochemical cycles in that it does not include the gas phase, although small amounts of phosphoric acid may make their way into the atmosphere, contributing in some cases acid rain. The water, carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur cycles all include at least one phase in which the element is in its gaseous state. Very little phosphorus circulates in the atmosphere because at Earth's normal temperatures and compounds, pressure, phosphorus, and its various compounds are not gases. The largest reservoir of phosphorus is in sedimentary rock. It is in these rocks where the phosphorus cycle begins. When it rains, phosphates are removed from the rocks and are distributed throughout both soils and water. Plants take up the phosphate ions from the soil. The phosphates then moves from plants to animals when herbivores eat plants and carnivores eat plants or herbivores. The phosphates absorbed by animal tissue through consumption eventually returns to the soil through the excretion of urine and feces, as well as from the final decomposition of plants and animals after death. Death. The same process occurs within the aquatic ecosystem. Phosphorus is not highly soluble, binding tightly to molecules in soil. Therefore, it mostly reaches waters by traveling with runoff soil particles. Phosphates also enter waterways through fertilizer runoff, sewage seepage, natural mineral deposits, and wastes from other industrial processes. These phosphates tend to settle on ocean floors and lake bottoms. As sediments are stirred up, phosphates may re-enter the phosphorus cycle, but they are commonly made available to aquatic organisms by being exposed through erosion. While obviously beneficial for many biological processes, in surface waters, an excessive concentration of phosphorus is considered a pollutant. Phosphate stimulates the growth of plankton and plants, favoring weedy species over others. Excess growth of these plants tend to consume large amounts of dissolved oxygen, potentially suffocating fish and other marine animals, while also blocking available sunlight to bottom-dwelling species. This is known as eutrophication. Hydrogen sulfide gas is released into the atmosphere by volcanic eruptions, hot springs, and anaerobic decay of sulfur-containing biological material in swamps, bogs, and tidal flats. Certain marine algae produce dimethyl sulfide, a volatile compound that enters the atmosphere as tiny droplets. Sulfur dioxide gas is released into the atmosphere by volcanoes and also forms when dimethyl sulfide reacts with oxygen gas. The burning of fossil fuels such as coal and oil releases sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide reacts with atmospheric oxygen to produce sulfur trioxide. Some sulfur trioxide reacts with tiny water droplets to form sulfuric acid. Sulfur oxides also react with ammonia to produce tiny particles of ammonium salts. The winds carry droplets of sulfuric acid and particles of sulfate salts, which then fall to the earth in acid deposition. By adding sulfur compounds to the air, the use of fossil fuels increases the rate of acid deposition. All living things require sulfur to make proteins. Plants get sulfur by taking up ions of sulfate salts from the soil. Animals get sulfur by eating plants, and all living things release sulfur compounds when they decay. The composition releases sulfate salts, which can be taken up by plants as well as gaseous hydrogen sulfide. Some hydrogen sulfide enters the atmosphere. But when decay occurs in an oxygen-free environment, anaerobic bacteria break down hydrogen sulfide and release sulfur gas. One of the biogeochemical cycle is closely linked to carbon cycle. The major sources of oxygen are atmosphere and hydrosphere. Approximately 21% of the atmosphere is composed of free oxygen, whereas oxygen is seen in the combined forms of water and hydrosphere. The importance of oxygen for sustaining life can be understood for the fact that all living things need oxygen for breathing and respiration. Burning also requires oxygen. This will discuss how such viral gas is maintained in nature. Photosynthesis and respiration are complementary processes in the living world. Photosynthesis used its carbon dioxide and water as raw materials to produce sugar and other organic molecules. These molecules in turn serve food for other organisms. All of this organism carries out respiration, a process that uses oxygen to release carbon dioxide from the same carbon atoms contained in the food. Thus, one process uses carbon dioxide and releases oxygen, whereas the other uses oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. These are major processes that help to maintain the balance of oxygen in the atmosphere. Another process is photodissociation of water vapor. Being a very reactive gas during its cycling, oxygen combines with various other elements such as solid or gaseous compound, oxides of nitrogen, and elements like iron and carbonates of calcium. These compounds may enter to other biogeochemical cycles. Some oxygen molecules will be converted to ozone. The reverse will also take place. To understand, observe the illustration of oxygen. The sun heats up the water from oceans, lakes, and rivers, and water changes into water vapor by the process of evaporation. Plants also lose water in the form of water vapor from their leaves into the air by process of transpiration. As the water vapor rises up into the air, it starts cooling down and forms tiny water droplets. These water droplets come together to form clouds. This process is called condensation. When the clouds start getting heavy and cannot hold the water droplets anymore, they fall back to the earth in the form of rain, hail, or snow. This process is called precipitation. Some of the water that falls on the earth seeps into the ground. This water is available to us in the form of groundwater. The remaining water falls back into oceans, lakes, rivers, and seas. This process is called collection. Then the sun starts heating up this water again. This circulation of water is called water cycle.